In this episode of the St. Philip Institute podcast, we're going to continue our series on the spiritual life and spiritual theology. In particular, we'll talk about what the spiritual writers call the Illuminative way, or spiritual adolescence. What is the second step in growth in the spiritual life? There's three stages: purgative, illuminative, unitive. What is the Illuminative way, and how does it relate to St. Peter after he denied Christ? Stick around to find out. Welcome to the St. Philip Institute podcast, where we explore the sources of the Catholic faith, including the scriptures, the documents of the Church, the teachings of the Second Vatican Council, and the lives and witness of the saints. St. John Paul II often said, "Duc in altum," set out into deep waters. And our goal here at the podcast is to help you do just that. We don't want to merely provide you with information. Instead, we seek to help you achieve a true transformation and to respond to the Lord's call in your life to live out the universal call to holiness. Hi, welcome back to the St. Philip Institute podcast. My name is Luke Arredondo, and I'm the Director of Faith Formation here at the St. Philip Institute. We are continuing a series on spiritual theology, or the theology of the spiritual life. In our last episode, we talked about what the spiritual writers call spiritual childhood, and really they call it actually the purgative way, but you can think of it as spiritual childhood. In this episode, we're going to talk about the second step. So basically, there is a spiritual childhood, spiritual adolescence, and spiritual adulthood, and they've got different terms in the writings of saints and doctors of the Church. Spiritual adolescence, which we'll talk about today, is called the Illuminative way. So it's the second of three stages, and you undergo a second of three conversions to enter into this life. So there's a conversion, an initial conversion to a life of faith through baptism that precedes even spiritual childhood. And then we talked about spiritual childhood, the purgative way, in the last episode. So now we're going to be looking at what happens after you transition out of spiritual childhood. So you go through another doorway. Baptism gets you into the purgative way, or spiritual childhood. What gets you into the illuminative way is the dark night of the senses. And then you begin another phase of spiritual growth. So that's what we're going to talk about, is what the illuminative way is, and what characterizes it, different forms of prayer that are common during the illuminative way, and those sorts of things. So as I said, you enter into the illuminative way, or this spiritual adolescence, by a trial known as the dark night of the senses. And this is going to often mean that you are no longer feeling sensibly as connected to God as you maybe were early in your conversion. Anyone that's ever been on a retreat probably knows that experience. You go on a retreat, and at the end of the weekend, you just feel super elated and just really on fire, like, I am going to go and just really take this into my life and just put all this stuff into practice, and I'm ready to get started. And, by Wednesday, you can just be almost feeling back on planet Earth. In a certain sort of way, spiritual growth, you see this just in general when you are growing and progressing, and then maybe you hit a point where you're just not feeling it. You don't feel as confident. You don't have as much joy. Prayer is more difficult. These are some of the things that characterize this dark night of the senses. And what's interesting, Lagrange talks about the idea that many people who are making spiritual progress, which already means a lot. This means, for instance, you're following the commandments, you are not committing mortal sin, you're growing in grace, you're praying more, you're doing all these really great things. But many people don't make it into the adolescent phase of spiritual growth, the illuminative way, because we're not willing to suffer that dark night, or we suffer it and we don't get the point of it. We don't learn from it. We maybe abandon, backtrack. And so it's good to know that actually this is something you should expect. I don't know enough about exercise to know if you reach plateaus and, deal with like, oh, I can't get any better or faster or stronger or whatever. Obviously, I am no athlete, but I imagine probably there are parallels in other areas of our life where you're doing good, making progress, and then you just feel like, I don't know what's going on, and you have to sort of break through. And that's what happens at the end of spiritual childhood, the purgative way. When you've already done battle with mortal sin, you're really growing in your devotions, you're praying, you're contemplating more, or you're meditating more, and you're beginning maybe some contemplation, and then you move into the dark night of the senses, and it can sort of be a shock to your system. But after you go through, if you persevere, you keep up your prayer, and you do all these things, you enter into a deeper phase or stage of the spiritual life. During this time, your prayer is going to be, according to the spiritual masters, more infused contemplation on the mysteries of the faith. So in the first phase, the purgative way, right, you experience sort of a lively faith when you look at, Lagrange tells us, the parables. And you get into the illuminative way. It's the mysteries of Christ's life, the mysteries of redemption that begin to speak more. And he actually gives us a model of what this looks like, and he says that we can really see this very clearly with the apostles. And he focuses in this book, The Three Conversions, specifically on St. Peter, that Peter, you will remember, if you know the Gospels, is super excited. He wants to, embrace the message of the gospel, but as soon as Christ says that he's going to suffer, Peter's very defensive. He says, I don't want that. You should not suffer. Please, let's not do that. And Christ tells him very memorably, get behind me, Satan. He has to recover from that. And he seems confident as the passion is approaching that no matter what happens, I'll never be separated from you. I'll follow you even to the death. And then what happens is he does deny Christ. So he has this sort of pride that gets crushed by his own failure. And Lagrange says it's immediately after that fall when he begins to enter into the illuminative way, that seeing himself rejecting Christ after having come so far sort of sets him into the dark night of the senses and propels him forward into the spiritual life that, wait a minute, I'm not going to give up. Now is my time to even go deeper. And the church actually gives us periods for, deepening our own spiritual life regularly at Advent and Lent. And Lagrange says these are periods where the church gives us this opportunity to seek the conversion that we need. And notice, it's the conversion that all Christians, even those who are already going to church, they're going to confession, they're trying, they need a conversion, and these are good times for this. So I want to look a little bit about what he says, Garrigou Lagrange, about St. Peter specifically. Essentially, and it's true for all the apostles, but he really zeroes in on Peter. So let me read just a brief paragraph here from this chapter on the illuminative way. So he's talking about the apostles. He says, they followed our Lord. They listened with admiration to his teaching. They saw his miracles and took part in his ministry. Three of them saw him transfigured on Mount Tabor. All were present at the institution of the Eucharist. They were ordained priests, and they received Holy Communion. But when the hour of the Passion arrived, an hour which Jesus had so often foretold, the apostles abandoned their master. Even Peter, though he loved his master devotedly, went so far as to deny him 3 times. And so this denial, Lagrange argues, and the spiritual masters, he quotes Catherine of Siena a lot in this chapter, and John Chrysostom point to this moment in Peter's life as the beginning of a second conversion. So he says, when did the second conversion begin for Peter? Immediately after his triple denial. And so we have this recounted in the scriptures that, this is from the Gospel of Luke, Peter remembered the words of the Lord as he had said, before the cock crows 3 times, before the cock crows you shall deny me 3 times. And this is the passage that Lagrange points to. And Peter, going out, wept bitterly. He then says, under the glance of Jesus, so just Jesus looking at Peter, and the grace which had accompanied it, Peter's repentance must have been deep indeed and must have been the beginning of a new life for him. And he has this great discussion about how, we shouldn't understand the spiritual life and trying to go from the purgative way all the way up to the illuminative and then the unitive way as though, any sin or any failing drops us completely back to our starting point. So Peter's got this a tremendous sin, right, to deny Christ publicly during his passion, no less. It doesn't kick him out of the spiritual life and start him back over. It's not as though none of the grace and growth and virtue that he had been practicing was ever going to be his again, and he was going to have to start from the beginning, but rather it is a conversion, it is a failure that God allows, that God will allow us to have some sort of temptation, some sort of falling. Why? So that we can realize more deeply and again our dependence on him. The spiritual life is so much about conquering pride, and as we grow spiritually, it can be very easy to feel like you know the answers and you have the authority to tell other people. As someone who works in ministry, reading this book from Lagrange is really, it's just like hard for me. Like, man, how often do I do this? I feel like I understand things so I can tell other people about it. But am I forgetting that this is not anything that's about me? It's a gift that's been given to me, and I need to hand it on to others. So Peter has this fall, right? And then he has a deep repentance. He uses this analogy. He says, when you're climbing a mountain, if you fall, you can just go back up. You don't have to necessarily go all the way back down and then start from the ground. So he says, everything that we know about the spiritual life leads us to suppose that Peter's repentance was so fervent that he not only recovered the degree of grace which he possessed before, so he doesn't just get back up to the level he was at prior to the Passion, but he was raised to a higher degree of supernatural life. Our Lord had allowed him to fall in this way in order to cure him of his presumption, so that he might be more humble and place his confidence in God and not in himself. And in a certain way, all of the apostles have this experience during the Passion where their faith is shaken. Remember, it's only John, right, who is at the foot of the cross. All the apostles are hiding out. Only Peter directly, rejects him, and of course Judas turns him over. But the apostles as a whole don't do great during the Passion. After the Passion, though, when the resurrection is announced, they begin to sort of get back in the swing of things. They begin to make progress again and to return to their faith. But notice now they're in a sort of dark night because sensibly they used to have Jesus with them. They could see him, talk to him, hear him, eat with him, right? And now he's gone. And so what this causes, this dark night, is a deeper reliance on faith. Remember, faith is in the things that we cannot see. And so there's going to be, in any sort of, growth in the spiritual life, moments where your faith feels weaker or less certain, and that's only so that it can grow all the more. As I was reading and preparing for this episode, something that came to mind, which is sort of I don't know, so maybe a sort of a strange analogy, but I'm going to go with it anyways. Apparently, if you want a very, very spicy jalapeno, you have to water it and give it sun and everything and take care of it, and then begin not to water it. You have to starve it, and that causes it to produce more seeds, and that makes it more spicy. So it's actually by sort of ignoring it that you ignite its growth again and make it stronger. And there's something just like this, with the life of the apostles and the spiritual life in general. You experience, most people, progress. They feel like they're doing better, and then suddenly it seems like, what's going on? And the appropriate response is not to abandon everything, but rather to put down our roots deeper, allow God to put his roots down deeper within us, and then persevere, and we find our faith actually stronger. So for Peter, right, the betrayal causes him to immediately begin to understand how everything should be fitting together. And for the rest of the apostles, it's sort of after the resurrection that they begin to see, what Jesus had been trying to tell them all along, and they begin to have more faith. So there's a lot here that we can sort of take in. I want to talk a little bit more broadly about what the life of prayer looks like, and the virtues that we grow in during this time. So, in the purgative way, right, the first stage or the spiritual childhood, vocal prayer is more common. The rosary is very important. The rosary is going to be important always, but it takes on different meanings, different reasons why it's important. In the illuminative way, the rosary really steps forward, and we begin to experience contemplation, both in infused contemplation and acquired contemplation during this second phase of the spiritual life. And the rosary points us to the mysteries. So there's different ways that people can pray the rosary and benefit from it, right? Someone who's new to Catholicism, new to prayer, you give them a rosary, it's a clunky thing they're learning to navigate. Maybe you get past that stage of how it works, and then you're praying and you're just sort of depositing prayers into the deposit box, right? I used to think as a child, saying a rosary was, it's 50 Hail Marys, right? It's 5 Our Fathers, there's however many 5 Glory Bees, and I would count up the prayers and say, okay, this is 50 plus 5 Our Fathers plus 5 Glory Bees, that's 60 prayers, and then there's the introductory prayers, so that's 3 more, and I would say, okay, 64 prayers or however many. You can add a couple here, extra devotions or whatever, and I'd say, well, that's cool. But it's the rosary. It takes a long time. Like, I could just say a whole bunch of Our Fathers, and it would be the same thing. I thought about it sort of mathematically, right? In the illuminative way, you're not praying the rosary like that. You're not doing the race car, how fast can you get around the curve, fly through the beads. But you are actually putting your attention on the mysteries. So something interesting that relates to this, in reading the Diary of St. Faustina, if you've never read it, it's a really interesting book, but it's also a very profound look at her soul, her spiritual growth. Early in her, time in the monastery, she wanted to receive a way of understanding, like, can you give me the stigmata? Can you let me experience? Lord, I want to experience the passion, so I know what you experienced, what you did for me. And it was a deep prayer of hers. She wanted God to let her suffer like he did. And the Lord spoke to Faustina powerfully, even in this, earlier years in her life. And he said, you're not ready for that kind of experience yet. You need to focus on my infancy. You need to focus on the mysteries of my life first. Put your attention there. Unite yourself to me in those mysteries. You're not ready to be united to me in that sort of more deeper way of the passion yet. She would eventually get to experience it, and it was something that was very, of course, very challenging for her. But the illuminative way is sort of this earlier stage of looking at the mysteries of Christ, especially at the mysteries of his life. And so the rosary becomes a prayer not just to knock out a certain number of Hail Marys, but a time to enter into the mysteries. During the illuminative way, we get especially more pure knowledge. We begin to understand things better. We have a greater gift of understanding who God is. One of the interesting things, as you look, and we'll see this in the next episode where we discuss the unitive way, sort of the third stage, but understanding starts to sort of give way to mystery again the deeper you go. But at the beginning, there's less understanding. You gain more understanding, more confidence during the illuminative way. You begin to meditate more deeply on especially the incarnation. You get a deeper knowledge of God and a clearer knowledge of yourself. However, we never seem to be able to recognize the depth of our imperfections even in this illuminative way. So we are still dealing with some sort of pride. And one of the things that happens, especially for people that are active in ministry or priests, is that we can begin to think that our success spiritually in our own life or in teaching and preaching, instructing and exhorting others, if people are getting a lot out of it and they're responding strongly to your writing, your teaching, your preaching, you can think that that's your work, that you've done that. And so the pride is a little bit less that like, I'm such a great person, and it shifts to, man, I've been growing spiritually, I've been doing all these things I'm supposed to, and now I have this ministry and it's flourishing and growing, oh man, I'm doing a great job with this. And it's not that the person's unimportant, but the fundamental thing is that it's God that is working in all of this. So let's go back and talk a little bit more about some of the ways in which the growth in love happens during the illuminative way. St. Catherine of Siena uses this term, Garrigou-Lagrange brings it out, and I really like it, that during the illuminative way, this middle second phase, we have still an inordinate love of self. Like, we don't love God with all our heart, soul, mind, and strength. And really, the spiritual masters say, until we actually, literally love God with all of our hearts, mind, soul, and strength, we're not where we need to be yet. If there's any part of us that doesn't love God completely, we haven't reached our spiritual maturity, spiritual adulthood. So even in the illuminative way, it is something to make it there, right? But there's still some inordinate love of self. Catherine of Siena uses this language of a mercenary kind of love. And I thought that was I really like that. Mercenary, right, means like you're doing something for hire. You're not doing it for its own sake. That we love God. We do love him in the illuminative way, but we're not loving God for his own sake. We've moved beyond fear. We're not loving God because, well, I need to love him so that I don't get punished, but we're not purely loving him yet. So Lagrange puts it this way. He says, it is a strange but not uncommon mixture of the sincere love of God, which we do have, and an inordinate love of self. The soul loves God more than itself. Otherwise, it would not be in a state of grace and it would not possess charity. But it still loves itself with an inordinate love. And I want to just pause there. This means even if you love God more than yourself, but you don't love him completely, you still are loving yourself too much. And that might sound like crazy, right? We understand when you're obsessed with yourself and it's all about you and that's all that matters. Okay, that's inordinate love of self. But here, Lagrange is saying, until we completely love God with all of our soul, strength, our mind, our heart, then we're still loving ourselves more than we ought to, because we ought to love God completely. So then he says, this is during the illuminative way, it has not yet reached the stage, the soul of someone in the illuminative way, has not yet reached the stage of loving itself in God and for his sake. Such a state of soul is neither white nor black. It is light gray, in which there is more white than black. It's on an upward path, but it still has a tendency to slip downward. So you can see this, in Peter's life, right? He was very certain of himself. He wanted to be the one who's, I'm going to be there no matter what. But when it came to the time of the Passion, he wasn't there yet because he still loved himself too much. So because of this, Lagrange wants to say, we've got to advance beyond the merely mercenary type of love. So this is from St. Catherine of Siena. She's talking about Peter. It was with this imperfect love, this mercenary love, that Peter loved the good and gentle Jesus, when he experienced the delights of sweet intimacy with him. So when Peter was getting sort of special attention, special benefits for his love, he was right there. It's time for this important moment, transfiguration, and I'm going to get to be one of the three that's there. Yeah, I'm going to be there. But when the time of tribulation came, his courage is lost. So she says, not only did he not have the strength to suffer for him, but at the first threat of danger, his loyalty was overcome by servile fear, and he denied him 3 times. But this is part of divine providence, that it's not uncommon for us to suffer some sort of very serious failing in order to humiliate us, and then again see ourselves as we truly are, and then reach out again more strongly in faith toward God. Like that jalapeno that's been starved, right? It grows stronger and then becomes a better version of what it is supposed to be. So Peter's failing causes him to be humiliated and then grow in humility. I once was in confession, and I was confessing something that I was embarrassed about. Usually you are. And I said, well, this is. I told the priest, I said, this is really humiliating. And I hadn't even said what it was yet. And he interrupted me and he said, sometimes the only way you can grow in humility is to be humiliated. Good. Tell me what it is. And so I went on with the confession, but I'll never forget this priest saying to me, sometimes you need to be humiliated, man. How else do you think, you're going to achieve holiness? You're going to achieve holiness in some easy, simple way where everything's nice and good. So the apostles, and Peter in particular, grow significantly in the passion, in and around the passion. Now, it's not as fast for all of them, right? The disciples on the road to Emmaus are certainly in need of further instruction. They didn't abandon Christ necessarily, but they were a little confused. They didn't seem to quite have enough faith, and they get turned around when Christ reveals to them the mysteries, right? So this is sort of an example of the Illuminative way where Christ is revealing again for the first time the deep meaning of the mysteries of the Scriptures to these apostles, so that they can sort of, get the message that they didn't quite get. So as you move beyond the illuminative way, you grow in these understandings, you then can be on the cusp of truly being united to God more. And that is going to happen in the unitive way. So a couple more things here just about the illuminative way. We can, as we get to the end of the illuminative way, if you're really progressing, you then will go through another dark night, and this is the dark night of the spirit, right? So the dark night of the senses, you have less sensible, sensations, right? You get less out of prayer. You maybe have less joy in your life. Things that normally bring you joy don't. Prayer is difficult. You feel like you're distracted. You feel like you can't concentrate, and you don't understand what's going on. In the dark night of the spirit, though, it's not going to be tempting you, toward laziness or adultery or something, but it's going to be temptations dealing with the supernatural or the theological virtues of faith, hope, and love. That begins to be where the experience of suffering actually enters in. So just to sort of recap, the spiritual writers will say that for the apostles, we can see they go through 3 conversions just like we're supposed to, right? They were fishermen doing their thing. Christ called them, and immediately they make this move into, the first steps toward faith. They follow Christ, right? And they're with him. They see him heal people. They see him work miracles, walk on the water, raise people from the dead, all of this stuff. But still, there's some weakness and some pride. After the passion and the resurrection, the apostles move forward again. They make a deeper sort of commitment. But it's not going to be until Pentecost that they enter into the illuminative way, which I think is sort of interesting because we just talked a lot about confirmation here, because we're still in the year of confirmation in our diocese, and we did a series on confirmation, and I talked a lot about the link between confirmation and discipleship, right? Confirmation is related to Pentecost, right? It's our personal Pentecost. And the spiritual masters, and we'll see this in the next episode, will show us that the Pentecost experience of the apostles is really what all of us are called to if we know the spiritual path to walk through the purgative way into the dark night of the senses, into the illuminative way, through the dark night of the soul, and into that illuminative way, that we'll experience what the apostles experienced at Pentecost personally. So that's kind of the basic outline for today on the illuminative way. It's that spiritual adolescence. And again, I want to emphasize, Lagrange says that, this is still rudimentary, right? You've just made it past the purgative way, but the purgative way is foundational and beginning. And he says not a lot of people even make it to the illuminative way because the suffering that they encounter can turn them away. So there is suffering, but on the other side of the suffering, a more refined love, or more refined faith, and a more refined hope. So hope you enjoyed this. Please stay tuned for our next episode, where we'll talk about the third stage or age of the spiritual life, the unitive way. Thanks.